Autumn had arrived in the Appalachian Mountains, turning the leaves into a tapestry of fire and gold. James Harlow, a traveling salesman of 36, guided his creaking wagon along a narrow forest path. Years on the road had etched lines of fatigue into his face, but his eyes still gleamed with a restless curiosity. James's life was one of endless movement. Towns blurred together, smiles, coins, and goods exchanged for brief moments of human connection. But each smile faded, and every handshake ended with the echo of empty roads stretching ahead. He longed for something. He wasn't sure what, but the road seemed to whisper promises of discovery. As twilight settled, James stopped atop a hill overlooking the forest below. The mountains stretched endlessly, a living sea of color and shadow. He took a deep breath, feeling the crisp autumn air fill his lungs, and whispered to himself, "Maybe tonight will be different." The forest seemed alive, not just with the usual rustle of leaves and calls of distant birds, but with something subtler, almost like a low hum vibrating through the ground. James paused, gripping the reins of his weary horse, and listened. "Just the wind," he muttered, but unease curled in his chest. He continued, the sound following him like a shadow. As he crossed a narrow creek, the water reflected a flicker of movement he couldn't explain. A fleeting silhouette, perhaps a deer or something else entirely. The forest's whispers tugged at the edges of his consciousness, and a shiver ran down his spine. Night was approaching, and James knew he needed shelter. Yet, the deeper he went into the woods, the more the trees seemed to close in, and the trail he had followed began to vanish under layers of fallen leaves. The next morning, James arrived at a small rustic town nestled in a valley. He wandered into a dusty general store, hoping to sell a few wares and get a hot meal. Behind the counter stood an old man with gnarled hands and piercing blue eyes. "You'd best turn back," the man said without preamble. "There's a cabin up the trail, deep in the woods. Many have sought shelter there, but few leave the same." James laughed nervously, brushing the comment aside. He was a man of logic, not superstition. "I've sold goods in worse places than the woods," he said. But a small, unshakable seed of curiosity took root. Who were the people that didn't leave? And what could be waiting for him in that forest? Eager to make up for lost time, James opted for a shortcut through the forest. The path narrowed, lined with towering pines and oaks. Sunlight pierced the canopy in thin beams, illuminating patches of moss that glowed faintly in the dim light. As the afternoon waned, James noticed a small lantern flickering in the distance. Curious, he guided his horse toward it, heart quickening. The lantern's glow seemed to dance, beckoning him deeper into the forest. Soon, he realized the trees around him were unfamiliar. The sounds of the forest had changed. The birds were silent, and the wind whispered in ways that felt almost like speech. Yet he pressed on, driven by a mixture of curiosity and unease. Through the shadows, a cabin emerged. Its timbers were weathered, ivy creeping along the walls, and smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Relief washed over James. Finally, shelter from the encroaching night. As he approached, the door creaked open. There was an odd stillness to the air, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. James hesitated but then stepped inside, brushing off his coat. The interior was modest but warm. A stone hearth, a wooden table, and shelves lined with jars of herbs and dried foods. The cabin seemed frozen in time, untouched by the years outside. An elderly woman emerged from the shadows of the cabin, her presence radiating calm. "You're far from home," she said softly, eyes glinting with a strange knowledge. "Sit, eat, rest." Her name was Mabel, and her voice carried a melodic warmth that seemed to settle the nervous energy in James's chest. She served a simple stew, and though he had traveled for days, it was the most comforting meal he had eaten in years. As he ate, James couldn't shake the feeling that Mabel had seen more of life than anyone he had ever met. There was sorrow in her eyes, but also a light that made the cabin feel like a refuge from the vast, indifferent wilderness outside. Night fell, and the cabin's hearth glowed like a heartbeat in the darkness. Mabel shared stories, some of the mountains themselves, some of the spirits she claimed wandered the forests. James listened, captivated, feeling as if the woods had taken on a soul he could finally understand. Her stories were more than tales. They were lessons wrapped in mystery. She spoke of people who sought the forest for fortune or escape, only to discover truths about themselves they had long ignored. James, a lifelong wanderer, felt an unfamiliar tug at his heart. Morning came, but the world outside felt altered. The sun's rays seemed muted, and the familiar landmarks he had expected to see were gone. He ran outside, expecting to find his wagon tracks in the dirt, but the earth was smooth, untouched. Panic began to rise. He tried to retrace his path, but the forest twisted impossibly, the trees forming walls where there should have been a path. The whispers of the forest returned, now clearer, almost like voices murmuring just beyond comprehension. James realized this cabin was no ordinary shelter. It was something else, something that held the forest itself in its grasp. Mabel's calm presence contrasted with James's growing anxiety. "This place, it shows people their truths," she explained. "Some stay to face them, some flee, only to wander lost." James struggled to understand. He had spent his life on the road, running from loneliness and fear, from the weight of unfulfilled relationships and missed chances. Could a cabin, a forest, really reflect the life of a man? Mabel's eyes seemed to peer directly into him. "The cabin doesn't trap you. It asks you to see yourself." That night, as James lay in the cabin, memories assaulted him. Faces of friends and family he had neglected, fleeting moments of love lost to the road, opportunities ignored. He saw himself not as the charming salesman, but as a man who had run from the world afraid of connection. The forest outside remained silent, yet its presence was overwhelming, pressing him toward realization. James Harlow understood that his wandering had not been freedom, it had been avoidance. And now, in the quiet of the cabin, he could no longer avoid himself. As night draped the forest in velvet darkness, James noticed shadows flickering across the cabin walls. At first, he thought it was merely the firelight playing tricks. But then, he realized the shadows formed shapes, faces of people he had known and lost over the years. A childhood friend, a lover long forgotten, a merchant rival who had once befriended him. Each figure silently stared, their eyes filled with longing, disappointment, forgiveness, and love. James could not move, could not speak. The shadows did not speak in words, but their presence communicated more than any conversation could. Each face reminded James of choices made, moments neglected, and the emotional cost of a life spent in motion rather than in connection. Tears streaked his dust-covered cheeks as he realized the weight of years gone by. Mabel appeared quietly in the doorway, holding a lantern. "You can leave this cabin," she said gently, "but you cannot leave yourself behind. The forest will offer freedom, or it will ask you to stay. The choice is yours." James's mind raced. To leave meant returning to the road, to endless wandering, perhaps, to repeat the same mistakes. To stay meant accepting a life rooted in reflection, care, and connection. Fear clawed at him, but beneath it stirred a strange hope. The hope of finally belonging somewhere, truly. For the first time, James felt that his life's direction was not dictated by duty or habit, but by a deliberate choice. James spent the long hours of night sitting by the fire, staring at the dancing flames. Memories flooded him. The lonely nights on distant roads, the missed birthdays, the fleeting smiles he had sold for coins. He thought of strangers who had shown him kindness, family who had hoped he would stay, and friends who had drifted away. For the first time, he acknowledged the emptiness that travel and ambition had left in his heart. The cabin seemed to breathe with him, each creak of the floorboards echoing his own unspoken regrets. In that silence, he began to understand that life's worth wasn't in distance traveled, but in hearts touched and lives cherished. By dawn, James had made a decision. The cabin had shown him what he had refused to see for decades, that running from life was not freedom, but imprisonment. He felt a strange peace as he accepted his past, flaws and all. He would no longer run. He would no longer seek purpose in motion alone. The forest, once frightening, now seemed like a quiet mentor, guiding him towards something far greater than travel or trade, a life of presence, care, and love. The next morning, James opened the cabin door. The forest outside seemed unchanged, yet somehow different, as if it had been waiting for him to awaken. The path he thought had vanished was faintly visible, winding gently into the woods. Yet James felt no urgency to leave. He had found something far more precious than any town, any road, or any sail. Here, in this cabin at the forest's heart, he had found clarity, stillness, and the first spark of contentment he had ever known. One misty afternoon, a young boy stumbled upon the cabin, lost and frightened. James, who had long been accustomed to solitude, felt an instant bond. He welcomed the boy with warmth, offering him food, dry clothes, and guidance. As they sat together by the fire, James realized that helping someone else provided a joy far deeper than any profit he had ever earned. The cabin, once a prison of reflection, now became a place where he could extend the lessons he had learned: compassion, patience, and connection to others. Days turned into weeks, and James settled into a quiet rhythm. He tended the small garden outside, repaired the cabin walls, and read stories aloud to the boy. Each task, simple as it seemed, brought a sense of fulfillment he had never known. The forest that had once whispered warnings now sang with life. Birds returned, streams gurgled in cheerful patterns, and the wind no longer carried ominous tones. James learned that true contentment was not in escape or survival, but in nurturing life, love, and presence. Inspired, James began carving messages into the cabin walls, words of hope, guidance, and encouragement for future wanderers. "Face yourself," one read. "Kindness echoes farther than footsteps." Each carving became a testament to his transformation and a bridge to others who might one day arrive at the cabin, lost or weary. James understood that while he had once wandered alone, his experiences could now illuminate the path for others, a legacy far more meaningful than any sale or transaction. One autumn evening, Mabel appeared once more, smiling gently. "You have learned well," she said. "You see that freedom is not in escape, but in understanding and connection. The forest now offers you a choice. You may leave, or you may stay." James looked around the cabin, at the boy he had grown fond of, at the carvings on the walls, and at the forest bathed in golden light. He realized he no longer wished to leave. The forest had given him what the road never could: belonging, purpose, and a chance to touch lives with care. Years later, travelers spoke in hushed tones of a cabin deep in the Appalachian woods where a kind man offered guidance, warmth, and wisdom. Some claimed the forest tried to trap wanderers forever, but those who stayed found healing, reflection, and inspiration. James Harlow, the wandering salesman, had finally found his final stop, a cabin with no exit, not because it trapped him, but because it had given him everything he had been searching for: understanding, compassion, and the courage to live fully. His journey had not ended with a road or a wagon, but with a heart awakened to the true purpose of life. In the quiet of the Appalachian Mountains, the forest, and the cabin, he had discovered that the greatest journeys are the ones we take within.